very cold 18th of November. Apologies again for the sort of sporadic nature of these programs. I'm actually still recovering from this lung infection that's still hanging around, but here we are back in the car. Hopefully my voice isn't going to crack quite so much today. The reason for today's broadcast is actually a piece of news which appeared yesterday, and that was a post by Colette Walker, the leader of the Independence for Scotland party, announcing that the ISP, when it runs candidates for election in the 2026 Scottish general election, is holding out the offer of cooperation, coordination, communication with all independence parties. In other words, she is making an offer to both the SNP, I presume, but also to ALPA, to work together to create what Mr. Salmon tried to do way back in 2021, which was to try to achieve the so-called supermajority in Holyrood. Now, there's a lot of mythology about the so-called supermajority, what it actually means. A supermajority is generally a term used when 60% of the elected politicians in a Holyrood general election are pro-independence in this particular case, all in favour of one certain thing, and so you get a 60% majority forming a government in Holyrood. Now that 60% is a benchmark. It's a bar which you have to get over if you want to change the standing orders of Holyrood. Now those would be the actual rules which govern what Holyrood does and doesn't do. However, that aside, let's assume for a moment that the supermajority is something worth doing, but at the very least, multi-party cooperation in 2026 has got some massive advantages for the entire pro-independence movement. Now, before you all start howling about, what about ALBA? They said this about the SNP, and the SNP said this about ALBA, and so on and so on and so on. We're not going to get into that today. The idea here is to look at what the ISP is actually suggesting, what the benefits would be for us, the voters, not the political parties per se, but the cause of independence itself. Now, whilst the SNP is probably still going to get a large number of first past the post seats, simply because they have the arithmetic to do that, there is a very good chance that the ISP and ALPA, if they work together, could hoover up a far bigger proportion of list seats if they work together in common cause. Now, it's interesting to note, and Colette Walker has reminded everybody of this fact, that the ISP actually predates ALPA by about a year. The ISP was formed approximately a year before ALPA came into existence under Alex Salmond. Now, ALPA itself formed initially as a group called the Alliance for Independence, which was an attempt by many different political activists, left of centre activists, right of centre activists as well, but all pro-independence activists, to form some kind of alliance for independence in 2021's general election at Holyrood. And it took a major change in complexion when Alex Salmond stepped onto the scene to become the leader of it, and of course the name changed to ALPA, and the rest is history. However, we're back in a similar situation now, and in 2 years' time we'll be asked to vote for a new government in Holyrood. And there's an opportunity here for ALPA and for the ISP to work together, at the very least, to gain list seats. Now, the ISP, being a small party, is mostly fielding candidates for the list. I remain to hear more details from Colette Walker about whether there are standing candidates in the first past the post election. It's entirely possible, and in fact that might well be part of the policy at the moment. But what's interesting here is the ISP is happy to work with any pro-independence party to put together a deal which is going to guarantee more pro-independence seats in Holyrood. Now, there is a risk here, obviously, because many people are forecasting that the SNP is going to get an absolute doing in 2026, just simply because of inaction, timidity, and lack of any real strategy towards independence in any meaningful way. However, a supermajority in Holyrood, including the SNP, presumably, if they win a lot of first past the post seats, but if there are an equal number of, let's say, list seats won by the smaller parties in an alliance like this, then we could have something very much more powerful in Holyrood in favour of independence than we've had before. But it does depend on the SNP changing its mind about a strategy for independence after that election. There's an awful lot of arithmetic and things that have to go right for this to work. I don't expect to convert a whole lot of SNP supporters to ALBA or to the ISP by making this broadcast, but I would like to remind all my friends who are still in the SNP, who still want independence, are frustrated at the lack of it, that there is an opportunity here to use their second votes. And using their second votes to vote for the ISP or ALPA, whichever they prefer, is more likely to guarantee a pro-independence list seat than voting SNP 1 and 2, which I know is still the current SNP policy. Now, it's a very short-sighted, backward-looking policy which flies in the face of the arithmetic of the D'Hondt system, which governs who gets elected in the lists. And the more SNP votes go to list seat candidates in the second vote, the more unionist MSPs get elected in the list, because it's basically denying a seat to pro-independent smaller parties. Now, the pro-independent smaller parties, if the SNP's main first past the post is successful, but if SNP voters use their second votes in this way and lent them to the ISP or to ALBA, and I know some people in the SNP wouldn't be able to stomach doing that, but let's say they did, or they have the choice of going to ISP in the second vote if they don't want to vote for ALBA, but let's say a few of them go to both, but because they're working in an alliance together, the chances are much better that one of their candidates is going to get elected as a list candidate and edge out another unionist bum on seats. Now, in doing that, if that can be done frequently enough, it's quite possible for there to be a full majority of pro-independence MSPs elected, and that means there could be a coalition government which includes ISP, maybe ALBA, and SNP MSPs all in a single government. Now, what would need to happen at that point, assuming that this was successful and we succeeded in getting this majority, an absolute majority government like this hasn't been done since 2011, in fact since Alex Salmond's first success, where he broke the system. But it could be done again. But we need to game the system. The whole system is set up as a game anyway to prevent independent supporters like us from gaining these list seats. And we already know that the unionists are already tactically voting for each other's parties in the list to make sure that a unionist gets into one of those seats. We just have to use the same playbook, but use it to our advantage. That's the pro-independence advantage, not the SNP advantage here. That's everybody's advantage. So if we get this majority in 2026 and we form a government, which may be a coalition, but it would be an outright majority. Let's say there were, for talking sake, over 70, something like that. 70 MSPs in that Holyrood Parliament who are for independence. Then it is time for us to start thinking about holding that second referendum. Now, we all know that back in 2018, Nicola Sturgeon famously said that being dragged out of the European Union against our will would trigger a second referendum. And we also know that it never happened when she said it would. And everybody felt massively let down. I haven't felt as let down since the day, since September the 19th, 2014. But anyway, all that aside, can we hold a referendum? Yes, of course we can. But remember, while all this is going on, while we're campaigning for this majority, and while the ISP is doing cooperation deals with smaller parties like ALBA and maybe even big parties like the SNP. If we do all work together and get the majority, then the independence referendum can be staged, because we also know that SALVO is working in the background at the UN to establish that Scotland is ripe for decolonisation, because the fact of the matter is Scotland is a colony, and the United Kingdom is going to have to either admit that it's a colony or that it is a UK protectorate. In other words, another old term for a colony. Either way, Scotland is entitled to self-determination because it's a colony, and that gives us the right to hold a referendum. Under international law, nothing to do with UK law, because UK law actually doesn't exist anyway. I've had that argument so many times with unionists recently, it's getting boring. Scots law pertains north of the border. So using our own law, we hold a referendum. And this referendum is not going to be organised and run by the United Kingdom. The count wouldn't be done outside of Scotland. Every vote would be counted in every polling station, and the tally of votes at each polling station would be added to a live totalizer so that we could see the actual result in real time, without the count and without the votes travelling a single millimetre outside of the ballot box or even outside of the polling station. All of this is perfectly legal, and we can easily get the observation and supervision from the United Nations, from the International Court of Justice, from the European Union. Observers can be sent to make sure that this is done scrupulously. And in doing that, if we obtain a majority for independence, however small, 51%, 50.2%, whatever it is, as long as it's more than 50%, then we have a majority for ending the Union. At that point, the Scottish Parliament can then suspend the Union officially, because the people have spoken. The United Nations can then be called in to ratify the result, and the Scottish Parliament can then, with the backing of the United Nations, declare the Union at an end and invite the United Kingdom to renegotiate a different treaty involving two independent states, and we would look for reparations for all of the stolen energy resources which have been looted from Scotland over the last 50 years, and the continuing drain of our renewable resources through multiple new cables being proposed by the United Kingdom, leading from Scotland's vast renewable energy arrays to energy pure England. So there's a lot really going on here, but the one thing that strikes me about all of this is that it enables one very important thing to happen, and you know what that is. I'm sitting here in a car, it's freezing cold. I know that all across Scotland there are pensioners in their homes who are too frightened to turn their heating on because of British government policies. Now that would end with independence, because under an independent Scottish government, we could take back control of the entire energy market in Scotland. Remember, the energy market internally in the UK is not internal at all. It's an external global market. The UK buys its energy back after having sold our energy, our Scottish energy, onto the open market, then buys it back and then sells it back to us again at hyperinflated prices. We would have the opportunity as a newly independent state to set up a state energy board, like we used to have in the old days of the electricity board, where domestic supply is produced at cost. And that means energy would be instantly affordable by everybody. We wouldn't have to give handouts to pensioners because they'd be able to afford their bills easily, the same as everybody else. And all the money that puts back into the pockets of Scottish people generally, voters, workers and the rest of us, is going to be injected into our internal economy, causing a massive growth spike. More jobs are created, more shops opened, more factories open, more stuff is made, more things are recycled, and so it goes on. Scotland becomes a much more successful place, not exactly overnight, but you can see how this would happen over several years. So what I'm asking from all of you today is just to think a little bit ahead into the next 2 years, no matter which party you intend to vote for in first past the post. think about how you use that second vote. That second vote is a roll of the dice. The United Kingdom has stacked the game in the second vote, so that if you win a lot of votes and a lot of seats in first past the post, and you apply that same number of votes in the second vote, they are diminished, massively diminished, to the point where you can't win a seat. And therefore it makes no sense whatsoever to vote for the same party in the second vote. It makes a lot more sense to make your vote strategically for one of the other smaller independence parties to ensure that a unionist doesn't get into that particular seat. And in that way, we can guarantee that we will have a majority in Holyrood in 2026, where the bulk of the seats on the list are being driven by purely pro-independence parties who have no other interest at all in being in Holyrood other than holding this referendum. And that means when they're in government, which they would have to be as part of that majority, some of them, then they are in a position to actually hold the SNP's feet to the fire and say, look, we're here now, we've helped you get this massive majority, we're in government with you now, we're asking you to do what you were meant to do in 2018 and hold that referendum. And that is the point where the SNP really needs to wake up and say, right, okay, well, we're here now, and we've got all you helping us, and all the people are behind it. Now we feel a bit more confident about holding this referendum. Let's go do it. But that's how it is going to have to happen, I think, just based on my own opinion of how this might pan out. But Colette Walker and the ISP are the very first political party in Scotland to offer the hope that this might happen. They are pro-independence. They do not take their seats in Westminster. If they want seats in Westminster, they would not take them. They are pro-women's rights. They want to protect the rights of women and girls from erosion by any kind of spurious legislation that in some way diminishes the hard-fought rights which women now have to safe spaces, for example, in one particular, for instance. But the interesting thing here is that Colette Walker is a woman. That shouldn't be important in politics these days, but I still think it is. She's also blind. She is also a disabled woman. And she represents the interests of Scotland's disabled people as well. So she has a very broad spectrum of support from women and from the disabled, as well as people like me. And I think it's important to remember that as well. I'll be interested to hear from my friends in Alba, actually, how they feel about doing a deal with the ISP. Do you think this would be a good idea? Do you think this is something that the current leaders of Alba might get behind? Because it seems to me that it could have worked for Mr. Salmond in 2021, were it not for the way the SNP campaigned back then. And were it not for the fact that there still seemed to be some hope that the SNP might hold that second referendum back then. But it now seems a forlorn hope. So let me know what you think. My feeling is at the moment this is probably the best piece of news I've heard for a long time. And I think it gives hope to all of us who want to see some light at the end of the tunnel, especially in these winter months at the moment. This is going to be the first of several winters we're going to have to spend while we are still working to become independent. But one thing we have to do in 2026 with this majority is our politicians need to repudiate the union straight away. They all need to go out and say, we reject the union. This parliament, this government completely rejects the union and will not cooperate with it in any way. We're going to offer the public a referendum to decide the matter. And that referendum is going to be held here under the eagle eye of United Nations and European Union observers to make sure that it's done properly this time. And I think there needs to be a very clear set of regulations about the role of the media in how that referendum is conducted. It could be actually that it could be the very first ever referendum conducted where the only medium that's allowed for campaigning is social media, for example. That might be one way of levelling the playing field when the BBC has dominion over the television and the radio, and the United Kingdom owned print media has a complete monopoly over the newspapers in Scotland as well. So we need to level the playing field, and the only way to do that is to get a majority and make sure that we repudiate the union, we reject it completely, and that we set the rules for this referendum here in our own parliament with our own government majority voting it through, because nobody else can do this. Only the Scottish elected officials who we elect in 2026 are empowered by the sovereignty of the people of Scotland to act on our behalf. And if we say to them, we want this country to be independent of the United Kingdom, we want this union over, and a majority of us have said so, that is exactly what has to happen. I'll leave you with that thought. Anyway, have a pleasant day, and I'll catch up with you, I hope, later on in the week. Bye for now.